This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Sharif Abdel-Qaddous.
At least 10 people were killed today in a strike by a U.S. drone in northwest Pakistan. There have been dozens of drone strikes in the past year that have targeted Pakistani and foreign militants, but also killed hundreds of civilians. The latest attack comes as a new poll commissioned by the satellite network Al Jazeera shows a majority of Pakistanis now view the United States as their country's greatest threat. According to Gallup Pakistan, 59% of respondents listed the U.S. as the #1 threat to Pakistan, ahead of 18% for neighboring India and 11% for Taliban fighters. 67% also said they oppose the U.S. drone attacks. The poll results come just days after the apparent assassination of the Taliban leader in Pakistan, Baitullah Mahsoud, in a U.S. drone attack. Mahsoud has been accused of organizing scores of attacks inside Pakistan, including the assassination of former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto.
Our next guest is a former Army captain who's been openly critical of the drone attacks inside Pakistan. Andrew Exum served on active duty in the U.S. Army from 2000 until 2004, including 2 years leading a platoon of Army Rangers inside Iraq and Afghanistan. He recently returned from 2 months in Afghanistan, where he served as part of the advisory team of the commander of U.S. troops there, General Stanley McChrystal. Andrew Exum is the author of the book This Man's Army, a soldier's story from the front lines of the war on terror. In May, he co-authored an opinion piece in the New York Times, along with David Kilcullen, former advisor to General David Petraeus, that called for a moratorium on drone strikes inside Pakistan. Andrew Exum is currently a fellow with the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C., where he joins us now. Welcome to Democracy Now! Explain your call for a moratorium on drone attacks.
Yeah, I should preface this by saying that I'm not saying that drone strikes aren't part of a proposed solution, but I think right now they're part of the problem. We've learned two things from Iraq and Afghanistan that I think are relevant here. The first is that you can't kill your way out of these wars. The second thing is, if you pursue a counter-terror strategy, or a counter-terror tactic, rather, that's divorced from other initiatives to extend the reach of governance, to provide essential services to a population, then you can actually exacerbate the problem in the area you're trying to affect. So just to give you an example, in Iraq in 2003, we pursued a decapitation campaign against former Ba'ath regime leaders. But what we ended up doing was, by pursuing very heavy-handed tactics, we actually exacerbated the cycle of violence in Iraq, and I think worked at cross purposes to ourselves. In Pakistan, I worry that we're doing more or less the same thing. Again, the death of a militant like Baitullah Mahsoud is not necessarily something to be mourned. But the deaths of low-level fighters and of their brothers and cousins, at some point you get to the point where you're not just attacking Al-Qaeda leaders. You're also making more enemies than you're killing them off. You're attacking people's brothers and cousins, and you're creating a problem for yourself that's actually going to grow and not contract.
On the issue of drone attacks, you say that they could be part of a proposed solution. There was a report released in June authored by Philip Alston. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions. This is what he wrote as part of the report. Targeted killings carried out by drone attacks on the territory of other states are increasingly common and remain deeply troubling. The U.S. government should disclose the legal basis for such killings and identify any safeguards designed to reduce collateral civilian casualties and assure that the government has targeted the correct person. Your response?
Well, I think that the second part of his statement is exactly correct. I think that you have to go through a degree of due diligence anytime you're going to pursue any type of capture-kill mission. Again, these types of missions are part of any coherent counterinsurgency strategy. It's how you keep the enemy off balance. But having said that, I think one of the things that's missing from the gentleman, and I'm in an odd position of actually defending these drone attacks, is that, and again, without getting into anything that's classified, in the open sources or just in the media, it's quite apparent, and it's been reported that the Pakistanis are openly cooperating with us with a lot of these drone attacks. The Pakistanis are quite enthusiastic about using these drone attacks to kill people like Baitullah Mahsoud, who's considered to be a threat against the Pakistani state. Where it gets tricky is where we want to target groups like the Haqqani Network or like the Quetta Shura Taliban, which are actually seen as assets for the Pakistani government. But these are the groups that are targeting U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, allied soldiers in Afghanistan, and indeed the government of Afghanistan. So I think the one thing that's missing from that report is the degree of cooperation that exists between the Pakistanis and the U.S. With respect to these drone attacks. And one of the things that's frustrating is that the Pakistani government's not open about that degree of cooperation and has not been honest with its people. So you're going to see in Punjab and in Sindh, you're going to see a lot of outrage towards these drone attacks. In the federal administrative tribal areas, bizarrely, perhaps, they're actually more popular. But again, I worry about this, that we're creating this dynamic whereby, because it just looks like these Americans fighting from the sky and invading, or rather impeding on Pakistani sovereignty, that we're actually setting ourselves back with respect to our strategic aims in Pakistan.
As the war in Afghanistan expands, as President Obama expands the war, your take on a military solution here, Andrew Exum?
Well, I mean, I don't believe in a military solution. I mean, even when you use force, you're using it for a political end. Having said that, I think in Afghanistan at least, and keep in mind I was working for General McChrystal earlier this summer, but his writ basically ends at the Durand Line. He's the commander of the NATO force in Afghanistan, and that force does not have any authority past the borders of Afghanistan, so no operations past the borders. Having said that, in order to be successful in Afghanistan, we need a mixture of things. Do we need combat operations against the Haqqani network, against the Quetta-Shura Taliban? Sure. We also, more importantly, need to be training up Afghan institutions. So a lot of our strategy, even though it's lopsidedly in favor of military means, we need to focus a lot on governance, economic development, addressing the needs of the Afghan people. And one of the things that, and it's inspiring to see in the micro level, if you look at the Marines down in Helmand Province, they're using a conflict assessment format which is allowing them to not just go after the enemy, to not just try to kill or capture their way to victory, but to look at what exactly is driving the conflict at the local level. In some cases it might be land reform, in some cases it might be land disputes, in some cases it might be irrigation or agriculture, and by addressing those problems, which may or may not be enemy related, by addressing those problems, we can stabilize Afghanistan. The unfortunate reality is on the ground in Afghanistan, we've got about 90,000 troops and we have very few civilians. The civilian surge that we wanted to accompany any military efforts in Afghanistan has been very slow to arrive. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that civilians are going to arrive in any significant or useful numbers until the spring of next year. And that's a big problem for our strategy in Afghanistan.
How open is the military to your call for a moratorium on drone attacks?
Well, the military is very much divided. I mean, you've got some within the military that favor a more counter-terror approach to this campaign, that favor targeting al-Qaeda's senior leadership. That, after all, is why we were initially in Afghanistan. You've got some in the military that would argue, you know what, it's not necessarily about decapitating the senior leadership. A guy like Stanley McChrystal, the current general in Afghanistan, this is a guy that's tried to, in commanding various special operations units in Afghanistan, he's tried to kill his way to victory. It doesn't work. I mean, we have tried with great enthusiasm and great effort to try to kill our way towards some sort of solution in Afghanistan. And what we've realized is that we have to create an environment in Afghanistan by building up Afghan institutions that makes Afghanistan inhospitable towards these transnational terror groups. So there's a dynamic argument within the military, but I think with the intelligence services, it's a completely different environment. Where I've gotten the most pushback with respect to our arguments against drone strikes has actually been from our nation's intelligence services. I believe that they're under a tremendous amount of pressure to kill senior leaders within al-Qaeda, and I believe they're trying to use whatever means they think are going to allow them to achieve that tactical end. But again, that's not the president's stated aim. We're trying to create an area that's inhospitable towards these transnational terror groups. Whether or not we kill Osama bin Laden in the long run is really not what matters the most.
Andrew Exum, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Former Army captain who served in 2000 to 2004, recently returned from 2 months in Afghanistan, author of the book This Man's Army. And he co-authored an opinion piece in the Times along with David Kilcullen, former advisor to General David Petraeus, just 2 months ago, that called for a moratorium on drone strikes inside Pakistan. As we turn now to a related issue, the issue of assassination. Sharif?
Well, yes, we're going to continue on the topic